This is my introduction to Sailing Wilson on YouTube. I'm Captain Wannabe Ian. Yes, I do have a sailing certificate. In fact, I have two. Whether I can sail or not is another story. I own a 2013 Island Spirit catamaran, 38 foot in length, and I really love my boat. I'm sure you've heard this before, but please give me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel and push on the notification bell. That'd help a lot. By the way, please share my videos with other people you know. I'm currently on the hard stand at Rebec Island Shipyard, which is in the top middle of the photograph. Rebec Island is a resort island just off the main island of Langkawi in Malaysia. Here's a Google Earth image of my boat just beside the blue dot on the hard stand, and here's a photograph of my boat just after I finished putting the copper coat on. I've still got a lot of work to do. This is part 15 of my progress report so far about my haul out at Rebec Island Shipyard. I made the mistake of not removing the tape after the epoxy, and I put the copper coat on top of it, so it made the task of removing the tape a lot harder. So I'm having to gently persuade it. I worked out a process to remove the tape a lot quicker by sliding a spatula on horizontal motion while holding one end of the tape and pulling gently, and it came off rather quickly. I still have to clean off the residue and dirt and muck above the tape line. I decided to remove the stainless steel step tow rail. I'm glad I did, because I found some water leaks underneath the stainless steel tow rail. My wife found two apple-sized soft spots on the starboard steps, so I had to ground them out, and I'm glad I did, because it was quite wet and damaged. I did the same thing on the port steps, cleaning up the rough spots in preparation for laying the epoxy and double bias mat on the second step. In addition to repairing those holes and leaks, I decided to put 30mm of Divinycell on the steps. I was lucky enough to buy enough Divinycell to do both the starboard and port steps. I'm using leftover pieces of the Divinycell to use it up, so that I don't have too much waste. Currently I have a really small amount of waste, not even half a metre, so that's great. Then I started the process of mixing the Kosan 90 parts A and B, used the acetone to clean the surface. So the next process was, because it was nearly 30 degrees, I had to be fairly quick about doing the job and getting the epoxy on the two surfaces, and then putting the double bias mat on top of the epoxy. The blue tape is to protect the cork decking. I've rounded off the edge. I thought about putting on a stainless steel rail, a kicking rail, but I want the water to run off the caulking, so I've rounded out the edges and I've taped to stop the epoxy from overflowing too much. And you'll see that I've rounded off the corners so that the dinghy doesn't bash up against it and cut it. I'm happy with the level and the strength and the overall job of the Divinycell laid up on the step. The vertical surface is nice and the edges are rounded off very well. The blue tape is to protect the decking from the next part of the job, which is the filler. We have enough filler to do at least one step, maybe the two. So the next part of the process was to get the co-fill filler onto the Divinycell surface and to fill up all the little gaps so that I didn't have to use as much epoxy. And I find that putting filler on is not as easy as I see most people on YouTube putting it on. But then most people don't shake as much as I do. Sometimes the shaking is a bit of a struggle for me. You can see I'm using my finger to finish off the corners. By that stage the sun had already dried it out and it was becoming harder to finish the surface. So you'll see that I've used the spatula to smooth off so that I wouldn't waste too much on sanding it back. I've sanded off, ready for epoxy and putting a layer of double bias mat on top of the vertical and horizontal steps. It was quite a challenge to put this on. It's well over 32 degrees at the moment. But it went on well and it looks like it's going to be a good job. So the next morning it looked pretty good. I didn't waste too much filler. So it was ready for sanding in preparation for laying the epoxy and then the mat over the epoxy. So then I went ahead and applied a second coat of epoxy. Because I'm going to put Divinycell, 30mm of Divinycell on the second steps, I need to extend the drain. So I've built a 1.5 inch piece of pipe, and to stop it running inside I've taped up a black hose and threaded the hose in, and then put the all-purpose glue around the join, and now I'm waiting for it to dry to test it to see whether it's successful. So repeating the same process, I put the Divinycell on the second step, but first I mixed the appropriate Kosan 90 parts A and B epoxy and stuck that, rolled that on top of the Divinycell and onto the fascia of the step, and then stuck the Divinycell to the step, and that's what it looks like. Once the Divinycell was dry, I used I think it's called a Dremel tool, to cut the edges flush with the step, and likewise on the side of the step. Took off the Divinycell, ready for rounding off the surface to make it look neat and tidy. So then I rounded off the edge of the Divinycell with a sander to make it look neat and tidy, and also to prevent any sharp edges, and rounding it off made it easy to also put the next layer of matte on and epoxy on. I had to clean up a little bit of mess that I made. Then I used Co-Fill, which is a Cossan product, a local product, to fill the gaps in the Divinycell so that I wouldn't have to use so much epoxy when I put the matte on. So here it is going on. It was rather hot and it became lumpy very quickly, so like epoxy, it's best to do it early in the morning when the temperature's not so great. And this is what it turns out like, and I still had to sand it off and prepare the surface for the next step. Then I laid the double bias woven mat. I can never get the words right for the different types of matting, or fiberglass mat. Here I am using scissors to cut it to shape. The first time I did the other step, I did it in one piece and found it a little bit difficult. Turns out that one piece was better. Trying to get the joins evenly matched was quite difficult, and it turned out a bit lumpy. Then I cleaned the surface with acetone and wiped it dry, and then mixed parts A and parts B of the Cossan 90 and proceeded to roll it onto the surface. And because I made a thickened batch, it was already fairly tacky, and laying the mat on top of it was fairly easy and straightforward, but getting the joins right was the pain in the neck. Then I laid the woven mat over the surface and tapped it down and rolled it to make sure it was wet and it was free of any air bubbles. I didn't use a tray, I just took it straight out of the cup. Found it much easier and less awkward. And again, I was pressed for time because it was still hot, and but I was able to get all the surfaces laid and wetted down, and this is how it turned out. Because I wasn't happy with the lumpy finished surface of even 3 coats of epoxy on top of the mat, I decided to put filler over the top of it and then sand down that filler until all the highs and lows were nearly removed. Just a little bit more sanding to clean up all the corners and joins and rounding them out before I spray paint the grey epoxy primer. That'll have to wait because we've had 3 days of heavy rain and I can't spray paint until it stops raining. So that will have to wait until the next video. The video was produced by myself, and it's the end of another exciting video of part 15 of my progress report so far on our haul out at Rebecca Island.